Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Isaac. For more programming like today, please go to our main website. You can access the Jersey City Free Public Library's main website at www.jclibrary.org. We also have additional programming on our YouTube channel. You can access more virtual programming by simply subscribing. Today, we have an author talk with Micah Salkind in his recent book, Do You Remember House? Chicago's Queer of Color Undergrounds. Micah is a special project manager for the City of Providence Department of Art, Culture, Tourism, and adjunct assistant professor of humanities in the Department of American Studies at Brown University. Thank you for being with us and welcome.
It's such a pleasure, Isaac. Thanks for having me.
So I guess we can start out with the process of writing this book. So can you just give us a little overview on how you did all this research?
Yeah, so the book came out of my doctoral work in American Studies. So I was originally interested in writing about how dance music changed and transformed when it went from the US to the UK and Europe in the 80s, and sort of was interested in the ways that it had been whitened and sort of like whitewashed, especially Black and queer club music from the urban Midwest. And so I started kind of like down this road of doing a research project that would look at those movements and those changes. And I still have a contemporary collaborator named Dr. Maida McNeil, who has a performance project in Chicago called Honeypot Performance. And she's an ethnographer and a scholar and a longtime lover of house music. She's from the city of Chicago, and she said, okay, this sounds like a cool project, but you should really come and see what's been happening in Chicago and understand better about like the roots of this music if you want to do this kind of project about where it went. And I think when I went for the first time to Chicago to the Old School Reunion Picnic, which is this incredible like 20,000, probably 30,000 person music festival in Jackson Park on the South Side, July 4th weekend. When I first went to that event, I realized, okay, like house is amazing and it's been all over the world, but it actually has a really important story rooted in Chicago and in Chicago's Black and queer communities. And that story hasn't really been told in a complex, nuanced way. So like, let's think about that and take the resources and time I have afforded to me as a doctoral student and really get fully into the worlds of Chicago house music in the place it was born. And so that's sort of how the research project came about, was a little bit of my own interest and expertise as a DJ and as a musician, and then also the influence of mentors, collaborators, artists that I was interacting with, to and following those threads and sort of listening intuitively to like what stories want to be told and how do they need to be told and how can I be of service to these stories and not kind of cover them over more than they already are. Is that a good?
It's perfect. So what is the story? Because I had a couple of conversations with people about house music, and some people believe it started in New York. Some people believe it started in Los Angeles. So what is the story?
Well, the story that I tell, which is about, centers Chicago, tries not to minimize the ways that queer of color club musics and cultures have been in all kinds of different urban centers in our country for, basically since the mid 60s through today, and probably earlier than that, depending on how you're counting. But I mean, if you think about the turntable technology and the kind of evolution of recorded music to get these like records that actually sound good enough to play on speaker systems, what makes house music unique and different from disco in New York or club music coming out of LA or club cultures in these places is that it kind of builds off this established commercial infrastructure of the independent soul and R&B industry that was in Chicago and that was flourishing in the mid-century. So you had this area of the city called Record Row, where there was, probably more than a dozen at one point, small record labels producing records by the Shy-Lights and by, different Chicago-based artists and artists that had kind of found a toehold in that city's music scene. So there was this established commercial infrastructure that really kind of was the underpinning of a lot of what commercial music came out. And then you had this cohort of like basically Black gay men and their friends who were throwing parties in the city, trying to emulate what they had experienced in the late 70s in New York. So there is a very much a connection to New York's disco cultures and like the way that people threw parties in the city. So they're not wrong that house music does have its roots in a certain kind of way in New York. But, you know, the way that I talk about it in my book, at least, is that house is this evolution in terms of the soundscape and the party culture in Chicago that's shaped by those industrial antecedents. So like you actually had people partying in the old warehouses where these records were being, you know, developed in these studios at Curtom or at, you know, these other smaller labels. So there's the spaces, and then there's the actual like skill sets that people have in the city in terms of getting that music to the marketplace, or, you know, the radio infrastructure. So there's all these little threads that come together and come to be called house music and house music culture in the mid 80s. And Chicago was the only place where all of that happened in this particular way. Because you could look at Detroit, and Chicago were kind of running neck and neck, and the club music that comes out of Detroit, a lot of it does sound like house music, and it could be called house music, but Detroit was marketed in the late 80s as a place where techno music was happening. So there's a lot of it is also just what was the marketing language. And there was a club in Chicago called The Warehouse, and the record store Imports, etc., started trying to sell records that were played at the Warehouse, and that got shortened. You know, in terms of, you know, you think about the record bin and there's like a little label that says what you know, this is warehouse music, that got shortened to house music. And so it's sort of like the evolution of this genre culture happened in this particular way, but other people were doing similar things. Does that make sense? So that's like, it's both really meaningful and kind of arbitrary.
In your opening chapter, you talk about this clash between house music and disco music, and how there was an incident that occurred. Can you talk about that? I think that's a really interesting part of the history.
Right. And I wouldn't say that there's a, you know, I'm trying not to describe it as much of this clash between disco and house, but this sort of marking between this ritualized death of disco music that happens at Comiskey Park, which is where the White Sox play in Chicago, and the kind of birth of house music culture after the late 1970s. So, you know, this rock radio station, which had been for a short time an all disco station, starts doing these promotions in Chicago around this idea of disco sucks, right? Which is a kind of homophobic and kind of explicitly homophobic, but kind of implicitly racist. I mean, if you understand that disco culture is Black folks' culture and brown folks' culture, like there's a real connotation there. And people in Chicago talk about that, like feeling of aggression and hostility around the disco sucks movement. But this DJ, this radio DJ on this station, started playing doing these promotions at suburban malls called disco dystrophy promotions, and they would blow up. They would have these sound effects of blowing up records. But then he kind of did this major promotion where he invited listeners to come down to Comiskey Park, and they were going to have a disco demolition in the center field at halftime. So it's like a Tigers-Sox game. He comes out onto the playing field. You know, this guy, Steve Dahl, comes out onto the playing field in like military fatigues. There's this big pile of records that people brought, some of which are disco records, many of which are just R&B, soul, jazz, Black music in general. And they literally blow the records up, and kind of pandemonium ensues. People charge the field. The Sox have to forfeit the game. So that moment of like ritualized, you know, people talk about it in the same way that they talk about the assassination of like the Black Panther kind of like COINTELPRO assassination. Like this is a ritualized murder of this cultural tradition that white Chicago needed to have but Black Chicago kind of like came back with a vengeance. So, Frankie Knuckles, who is kind of called the godfather of house music, talks about house as being disco's revenge. So the idea that you couldn't really kill danceable music by blowing it up, symbolically or literally, and that this energy and this desire to be together and to party in this way, which is kind of to listen to great dance music that just has this insistent beat and to go all night long until the sun comes up, that wasn't going to go away because white people, and kind of this white rock radio station had this event. So there's this kind of moment there that I'm tracking in my writing of a break, even though there's not a real hard break. Like disco continues to be a part of house music. But when you start talking about the records that get produced in the mid 80s that are understood to be like the first house music records, they're really coming out after the end of commercial investment in disco music. So when the demolition happens, disco is this incredibly lucrative market in the American recording industry. So it's got tons of resources being pumped into it. So you have big artists singing disco songs, the Rod Stewarts, the Barbra Streisands, whoever, and you have these lush orchestral arrangements. So the kind of classic example is the Philly soul sound, where you have a string section and French horns and all these incredible instruments on the records. That goes away in the early 80s, but Chicagoans still wanted to kind of emulate those sounds, and so they're using like synthesizers and drum machines to recreate the disco sound. And that kind of is what is at the core of house music as a genre, is that kind of emulation of disco and the furthering of a disco soundscape using these new technologies.
But why does disco begin to decline? You speak on the sort of popularity of disco and how it declines. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I see it is that for Black, brown, and queer communities that love disco, it didn't decline. I think there was a backlash against disco because it was gay people's culture and it was Black people's culture and brown people's culture that, the recording industry pulled the resources out. So it was this hyper investment in this kind of like fervor to get into to jump on what's, scholar Bill Brewster's called the disco bandwagon. And this happens with trends all the time, right? You have a subcultural thing that the mainstream gets interested in, and there's a lot of investment and interest, and then that wanes, whether it's because the subculture, in the case of disco, is too undesirable to be associated with, or it's because people just get tired of it and move on. I mean, I think with disco, it was a little bit of both. When you hear the records that were being put out on major labels at the end of the 70s, it can be kind of schlocky, or like, there's a saccharine quality to the music, which is not as interesting and inventive as the kind of harder edged R&B and funk records that were getting played by disco DJs earlier in the 1970s, records coming out on Prelude and West End, which are these smaller labels in New York City. And now today, there's a huge interest in disco music, and it has a huge influence on major pop artists, right? So you have records by people like, like Dua Lipa or Kylie Minogue, and those are, for all intents and purposes, disco records, or, Jessie Ware. And those are all white artists, but Black artists are using disco as a soundscape. Amber Mark, Beyonce and Solange use disco elements in their music. So it's a part of our musical DNA now in the United States, at least, and certainly, in places that are influenced by our musical cultures. So it's not gone, but that kind of investment where you could have members of the Philadelphia orchestra playing on recordings at the Sigma Studios, or you could have these kind of major artists putting out disco records that would get played on pop radio. There's not that really hasn't been so much a thing in the United States since the 70s in the heyday. So that's sort of what I'm trying to track with the like ways that the music changes and evolves, and how house emerges. And then, I don't think house ever has the kind of major label investment that disco does. You know, in the 90s, there's kind of a moment where house is pretty visible through the work of people like CeCe Peniston and Crystal Waters, but it doesn't have the kind of exposure that I think disco did in the late 70s.
Is house music tied to any social movement?
I think that people who are involved in house music in Chicago see their work as being like really related to the long civil rights movement, right? So they're the children of people who were involved in tenant organizing and integration of schools and kind of the people who push back against gentrification and redlining in Chicago. These are people who party together to house music. So I think for them, it's the soundtrack to a lot of the work that goes into their activism and their and really seeing their activism as a place. It's not just all about strife and hardship, but there's also a need for pleasure and joy and connection. So I do think it has a place in the history of social movements, and certainly in terms of making gay people's culture and queer people of color's culture visible on a kind of broad stage. Like, that's a hugely important thing. I don't think you don't have an artist like RuPaul having the kind of cultural cachet she does without, you know, her supermodel as a house track, you know, and that's like, you know, she comes out of that New York underground musical culture that's connected to New York disco, Chicago house, Baltimore club music, Detroit techno, all these, you know, probably she's from Florida, so bass music in Florida as well. So yeah, I think it does. And I think for a lot of the cultural work that queer people are involved in and that women are involved in, you know, it doesn't get understood as properly political. It doesn't get imagined as a space of activism and advocacy, because a lot of the edge is hidden underneath the kind of veneer of I don't know how to put it. It's like the kind of critique is hidden in there in the beauty and the pathos and the kind of the pop the appeal, the pop appeal of it, but it's still there. Like an artist like Sylvester, you can't deny their impact on the world just by being who they were, just by performing as a gender non-conforming Black artist in the early 80s. You know, that was a political statement, it remains a politically powerful statement. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that, and also not ask that those that political work has to look like the kind of more masculinized, out in the streets, also important political work that goes into movement building, but to try to understand them in conversation with each other, and you know, what is the cultural arm of a movement except the art that people make. You know, it's Harlem Renaissance. You could see the influence of these earlier Black arts movements in Chicago, at least, on house, and it's people's communities, it's their parents, it's their church, whatever that the case may be. It's legacy work and it's lineage, and I think it's really powerful and inspiring. And so I hope other people who are, you know, involved in the culture and see themselves as part of the culture, I hope they understand their work in that way. But, you know, it's also like some people don't. Some people are like, I'm here to party. My party is not my politics, and that's cool too.
House music is often confused with like techno music and trance music. Can you talk about the distinction? What makes house music house music? What separates it from any other genre?
Such a good question. And I think it's something that a lot of people who think about and write about electronic dance musics are constantly asking themselves, okay, why do we have so many genres? What are we telling ourselves about the listening and the production of this music by you know, parsing it into such fine-grained distinctions? But, you know, for trance and techno in particular, I think those musics have their own particular emplaced social histories, right? So techno, as I said before, like it comes out of a marketing of Detroit's electronic music scene. So a kind of European repackaging of that music scene. There was a kind of well-known, I think it was a CD box set. It might have come out in other formats as well. That was like the techno sound of Detroit. And then that term really just got associated with the music. And I think if you listen to what people describe as techno and what they describe as house, oftentimes the techno music is just a little more abstract, a little more minimal, fewer vocals, fewer, disco filtered samples and things like that. And I think in terms of trance music, the trance music that I know from listening to dance music as a teenager, it comes out of kind of a European, like a Dutch or UK based or kind of otherwise European club culture. It's really fast beats per minute. It's much more like the synthesized sounds are much more upfront, really melodic in a lot of cases. So I think there's ways that house touches both of those soundscapes, and I think all of these things overlap and blur. And I think a lot of times the names are about marketing and trying to figure out, okay, who's my audience for this? With trance, how do I market this so that it doesn't get associated with the stuff that maybe I don't want to associate with house music or with techno or whatever the thing may be. Maybe it is a little bit, it's trance tends to be closer to like the 130 BPM range, whereas house and techno can be faster as well. House is really like at home in the 120 to 125 beats per minute range, at least in terms of how I think about it. But the distinctions are only as meaningful as you want them to be. It really is marketing for the most part, but it is meaningful, and people use those categories to talk about their interests and their affiliations, both like musical and cultural. So yeah, I think, does that kind of like answer the question of it's important and it's not?
You titled the book, Do You Remember House? So why did you title that, and why is house music often forgotten?
That's a great question. So the book ended up, so when you start a research project, you sort of have an idea of the direction you're going and what your concerns are. And I mean, as a historian, I'm interested in memory, and so that was totally on my mind as I was doing these oral history interviews that are the kind of core archive that the book builds from. But I think only after finishing the project did I realize that it is really a memory studies project. It's about how communities, and this particular music community, really practices their memory culture in certain ways, right? So Do You Remember House was a way of like kind of hailing those rituals of remembrance and recollection. And also, there's this great track by New Jersey-based producer Blaze with the artist Palmer Brown, which is called Do You Remember House? And it's actually the epigraph of the book is the lyrics from that song. And it's a really great example of this kind of tradition in house music of people using their lyrics to actually teach people about the history of house. So that, like, what in my head I call them like didactic house music tracks. So they're in the vein of like, do you remember house? Back in the day, we did this, we went to these spaces, we practiced these traditions, we wore these clothes, and house culture for a particular subset of middle-class Black Chicagoans in the mid-'80s was very much like a preppy culture. So, people talk about wearing Izod and polo and, Givenchy, whatever, there's all these ways that people talk about that stuff in the music itself. So that was important to me to convey right away with the title of the book. This is about this culture being steeped in its own retelling of its stories. And that actually, one of the things I kind of concluded, and this is like one of the things I hope people take from the book, is that if you're participating in house culture, you're actually asking and interrogating the questions that we're talking about today, like where does it come from? Where are the limits of it? What does it mean? And that's part of your participation is constituted by that questioning and that re-remembering of the ways that you've participated and what you've heard about it and all that stuff. But to the second part of the question, like why I think it gets forgotten or elided or covered over, I think simplistically racism and homophobia, I think that that's at the core of, why if house and hip hop are the kind of two children of disco that emerge in the 80s, how is hip hop so much more popular? How are there 100 academic monographs about hip hop and like a handful about house music? And that's just one measure of, how seriously people take the music. But, certainly there's been a rejection of Black queer culture on a national and international scale that has made it hard for house to break out of its kind of underground space. And that's, I think, in some ways to house's advantage. I don't think, you necessarily benefit by being overexposed or, consumed at the degree with which a mainstream culture gets, hip hop certainly has suffered because it's been so mainstreamed, in terms of the narrowing narratives that are possible in the commercial hip hop space. But I think at the same time, like house also challenges what we think we know about genre. And there's a really amazing Chicago DJ named Dana Powell, and when he tried to talk about the limits of house music, what it actually, where does the line fall between what's house and what's not house, he said beautifully, house is also always. It incorporates as much as it disincorporates. It's always about including more sounds and different sounds. And I think that has made it hard to market, If you can't pin it down, how do you sell it? So those two things I think have really helped keep house underinvested in and also underexposed in ways that are both good and bad for the culture.
Coming to the end of this segment, my last question, how do we honor house music?
Great last question. So my practice of honoring, in my work as a public scholar, as someone who cares deeply about this music and this culture, is to continually lift up the creators and to create platforms or support platforms that, value and elevate the stories of house people who are living and working today in Chicago. Like, we don't want to wait to give people their roses. I think Frankie Knuckles passed when I was doing my research in 2014, and he never really got the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. He was a globally renowned recording artist, Grammy-winning, touring and remixing artist. But he shouldn't have had to keep working the way he did. Really worked himself to death. And so there's something to be said for, let's give people their roses now and let's celebrate them while they are with us. And as these elders begin to pass on, let's make sure we don't lose their stories, because, we don't know who's going to be touched by this music culture, especially like who's the young queer of color person who's going to be seeing themselves in house and make the next thing, right? Like, to push our culture even further forward towards freedom and liberation and connection. So yeah, that's, I think for me, like, how can we support it? Is continue to tell the stories, continue to make sure that they're connected to the places where they come from and the people who gave life to them and who needed these musics and these cultures to stay alive, right? I mean, there's just so much there. But yeah, just just do my little part and keep on supporting. I continue to do work with the Chicago Black Social Culture Map project, which is about convening the creators of house music and making sure that their stories are accessible to people and digital formats and exhibition work. So yeah, I'll put a plug in for that, the CBSCM. Check it out.
For the viewers, where can they purchase your book?
So the book is out on Oxford, so you might have to go to like a university library as opposed to your local bookshop, but anybody can order it. So if you love shopping at your local bookseller, just ask them to order it for you. It's not going to be that much more than it would be online. You can, of course, get it on the popular online outlets. They'll send it to you right away. Yeah, and there's ebooks available as well, or go to your local library and check it out. So, you know, big ups to the librarians who are making sure this is available to their patrons.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Isaac. I so appreciate it.